So today's musings is about the aesthetic explorations in QA. So I guess it's quite naturally bordering on the sense of art rather than the science and engineering per se. And that's something that I deeply feel, because at the end of the day, there is science, there is engineering, and there is art. Science gives us the technical ways to analyze, solve problems. Engineering allows us to implement it in a practical sense, and art elevates it so that we can actually express our best and hopefully get a lot more joy in the act of doing. And that's why this particular topic is always very dear to me. More often than not, I think we see testing as a technical, process-driven discipline, right? And therefore there is a fair bit of science and more often an engineering which is driven by a sense of meaningful processes. But in this session, we will kind of go beyond the mechanical routines of what we do in the context of validation/testing and kind of immerse ourselves in the idea of, in the notion of artistry and aesthetics, and see how it actually changes our perception of what we do and how it helps us to deliver our best, right? And that's what I really want to kind of touch base on. So when you look at it, you see that if you go beneath the typical top process technical driven discipline, there is a lot more interesting stuff. There is a space of beauty, a sense of balance, a creative intent, inspired, if you will, from various facets of art and artistry. Could be painting, could be calligraphy, could be sculpture, music, dance, photography, as you can see, artistry, architecture, and also kind of, the storytelling. So if I were to very quickly do a bit of a parallel, and what I mean by that is something like this. So if you kind of correlate the idea of painting as in an aesthetic and artistic sense from, let's say, looking at the bigger picture, connecting, layering, that's something interesting. Whereas when you look at it from the lens of photography, if you will, it is about, how do I capture moments, how do I focus, and so on. If you look at it from the aesthetic sense of writing and calligraphy, we're talking about elegance. When you're looking at it from the fluidity of dance, we're talking about the adaptability and the graceful responses that we do to adapt constantly to what we do. And stepping down a little further, if you will, and if you look at the other forms of artistic abilities like sculpture, which is about, making a clay into an interesting stuff, which is about shaping, it's about fine-tuning. And when you look at music, it's about the notion of harmony, it is about the rhythm. And when you look at it from the act of storytelling, then you ask the question, is what we are reporting, is it just a dry report, or is it something more? And therefore, is it more like a narrative? Is there a suspense? Is there some interesting ways by which we communicate and connect to the humans? And the last one is to look at it from, does architecture play a role, and what is the meaning of architecture in our context? How does the beauty and the structural soundness add and lend credibility to what we do? So that's to give you a bit of a landscape of what we are going to talk about in the next few minutes. And all I'm trying to do is to kind of very briefly connect to each of these ideas, and I'm sure each one of you here will have your own interpretations and connect onto more interesting things on each of these areas if we all reflect. And my intent is to kind of elevate this, so to speak, and connect it to a higher degree. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes over a set of slides is to take each one of these that we've outlined as painting and so on and so forth, and just kind of maybe walk through a little bit, add some ideas, and hopefully help you reflect and muse about it. Okay. So all we're trying to do is to see how the embracing of the beauty, the intuition, the creative structure not only elevates our practice, but also brings about a more deeper insight, satisfaction, and hopefully a lasting value. Because especially in these times where I think there is far more greater expectations from human, because machines have become intelligent. I think some of these ideas could be very relevant, and as we go on, to unraveling ourselves to the next level of what we can possibly do as an individual tester slash a community of testers, so to speak. Right? And we will look across the various life cycle aspects of design, execution, discovery, and so on and so forth, and connect it to some of these art forms, the classic art forms, right? So when you look at a painting, what do you see? You see an empty canvas to start with, and then a good painter converts that empty canvas into a stunning art. So what we start off is something empty, right? And somehow in the mind's eye, the painter visualizes a few things, sees the bigger picture, maybe sketches an initial idea, and then converts the sketch into a beautiful painting, colors it as appropriate, and suddenly it takes life. In a similar sense, when we are looking at it, when we are trying to evaluate a product, when we're trying to understand a product or an application, the question is, what do we mean by saying the big picture? How do we see the stuff that is hidden? Because we're not just looking at the interface, if you will, right? We are looking at the white canvas and kind of figuring out what may be required, what could go wrong, what is intended, what may be intended, how does it affect, and therefore kind of get a better idea of the bigger picture. And therefore, in a way, we're trying to kind of figure out and understand better, and therefore can I compare the act of going through this entire process of understanding and subsequently designing, which is a very layered approach. The idea of looking at it from various angles, across various layers, and composing, and also looking at the negative space, that means space which are invisible, right? Things that are not filled in. And the subtle notions of shading to create a better sense of coverage of what we want to do, so that we feel more comfortable and satisfied that we cover. So it's more like saying, what we see is a blank canvas, and from there, where if you really visualize, how does the first stroke go, where does it go on, how do we convert? And therefore, when you look at it from that perspective of a painting where we are more inspired by the idea of layers and composition and space and shading, then what it kind of tells you is maybe the act of design that we do is there is a technical piece, but if you dig in a little further, it seems like a bit art, like an art, where we start off with a broad brush, we kind of go and layer in the details, we discover the larger and the bigger picture, and we kind of go through some of the subtle nuances. And therefore, there is a sense of art of the test design, which is kind of equivalent to the idea of, a raw sketch to shade and, kind of a surprising picture that emerges, hopefully far more beautiful. And it gives us a sense of satisfaction and obviously adds a lot of joy to the recipient at the end of the day. So, in a way, it's like saying, look, every form at the end of the day is there is a science, there is engineering, there is art, and art is ultimately the final expression of craftsmanship that each one of us have. And here we're just looking at one facet and trying to seek some connections to some of the art forms. So here we're looking at the act of design, and we are in some sense connecting to the idea of paint. Right? Now, when you look at the idea of simplicity, ultimately we all know systems are complex, but a good craftsman ultimately renders it to be far more simple, so that we all seek clarity, we seek simplicity, and therefore we understand in the larger picture, we see the flow, we are very well connected. So at the end of the day, testing truly is about figuring out the simplicity in the myriad of complexity, right? And therefore, the real question here is, do you feel the notion of elegance both in the context of code and in the context of test? Just like what you might do in other forms of art. Could be calligraphy, could be art, could be music, and so on and so forth, right? So if our whole objective of testing is in some sense the act of questioning, understanding, exploring, to ultimately simplify and in the process find issues, suggestions, improvements, then there is a notion of elegance that we're looking for, because ultimately something beautifully simple is fundamentally very elegant. So we're really asking a question, what is clean, elegant QA? How do you know it feels just right? And just like art, it comes from lack of clutter. It comes from a good, careful selection of what we do. So, be it a developer, as in terms of saying, do I see a sense of beauty in my code, or in the context of QA, what is the notion of beauty and elegance in the context of the QA work that we do? How do we understand it well enough? How do we simplify it well enough? How do we see that in the mind's eye? And suddenly everything emerges very well. And this is it's a process, right? It's not something that's just going to emerge automatically. We do expend some meaningful intellectual energy to convert the apparent notion of complexity into something that is meaningfully simple, and that's what we're trying to do. So, truly speaking, testing is all about is to simplify, right? To remove the clutter, to see the elegance, the beauty behind. Now, we talked about science, we talked about engineering, but when you look at the potter's hand, and then if you see the clay suddenly being transformed into some beautiful shape, what you see here is the act of a practiced craft, something that with enormous amount of practice, the gentle hands of a potter, the firm, gentle hands of a potter actually spinning on the wheel does something magical. And then, of course, after it's glazed and painted, etc., it's transformed into amazing stuff. So there is a lot of intuition, there is a lot of sensory aspects that go by which how a potter shapes, a pot, so to speak. And therefore there is a sense of a maker's touch, which actually shapes the results, the outcomes that we have. And therefore, the parallel that I'm trying to connect on is QA is like any other discipline. Every discipline can be elevated into a craft, and therefore I'm suggesting, so to speak, that QA is a craft, and therefore there are small touches, there is practiced care, and there is personal artistry, which is highly individualistic. And they matter in addition to the tools that we use and the process that we use. So the question that one can ask ourselves and reflect upon is, what's your QA signature? What is your personal signature in the context of QA? How do you, what is it that is unique to you, and what is your potter's touch? What are your fingerprints of craft in your testing, right? And it's more of a reflection question. There is no specific answer. Each one of us, I'm quite sure, will, when we reflect, find something very unique in how we do things and how we connect on to what we do. And therefore, QA is really a craft. It's the hand, the eye, and the heart, right? And that's really what I'm trying to allude to. And therefore, the analogy most probably apt is a kind of the potter's wheel, so to speak. So we connected various facets just to kind of get a sense of idea from, be it the painting or be it the calligraphy or, in this case, the potter. And if you kind of stretch it a little more and continue on, then you're saying, look, a good music, it's very harmonious. And the act of composition of music, the act of rendering the music, there is a sense of balance, there is a sense of coverage, there is a sense of harmony, there is a sense of avoiding any noise that comes across, because our ears are so beautiful that if we see a little aberration, we can sense it, isn't it? And the question that we're asking was, hey, when we test something, how does it sound? Is it noisy crowd? Is it like a well-rehearsed ensemble? And therefore, if you say I've got suites of tests, maybe you start off with an initial suite and quite obviously you will extend it over time. Does it sound like a symphony? Does it have a beautiful balance of depth, coverage, and focus? And does it produce a sense of harmony that you can feel rather than, a noise and a drone of just doing things, right? So we're kind of connecting the act of suites and the corresponding execution to see if there is a certain degree of flow, is there a certain degree of harmony and beauty in the entire notion. So we're trying to kind of put that focus, if you will, in how we compose and build our suites, and therefore look at it from the ideas of the harmony, the various contrasts and the various balances, the yin and the yang, so to speak, right? And therefore we're trying to seek a connection to music in this case. So this is moving on from a bit of a design to moving on a bit of the understanding to moving on to the composition of suites and so on and so forth. Now I'm sure some of you might have heard about it, the idea of the kintsugi pottery. In Japan, when pottery obviously breaks when it falls. And normally we think we always have the sense that, once something is broken, we always think of it as not good. Japanese had a slightly different way of looking at it. So they developed a style called kintsugi, which I'm sure some of you know. And kintsugi pottery is the art of, in a way, lacing a broken pottery and connecting them back using gold or, gold color. So as you can see in the pottery on the left, you see, slices of these gold. What are they? Basically, they are, the pottery that is broken is put back together with a glue, which has a shine, in this case, as you can see, gold. So that entire realm developed, and it's now popularly known as the kintsugi pottery. So what are we talking about? Why are we talking about this? We're trying to say, look, bugs are not bad, right? We all kind of know that technically, so to speak, but if you look at it from the aesthetic lens, what we really ask is, what do recurring bugs reveal about our systems? Because it's not that all bugs are ugly. It's like the cracks are not ugly. They have a different sense of beauty. And like that, in our bugs, some reveal stories, some reveal patterns, and they give us the true shape of the system, just like the cracks in pottery. And therefore, flaws add beauty. So we don't have to have a very myopic notion that flaws are bad. Not necessarily. Flaws are something that are interesting enough, and just like the kintsugi, that's where the act of lacing of gold adds extra value to the pottery itself. And therefore, the interesting question that we can ask to ourselves and reflect upon is, have you ever found a beautiful bug? Do defects reflect unexpected value? And I'm sure all of us do that, right? And what we're trying to do is we're constantly learning and adjusting and so on, because some flaws aren't just failures. They tell you a story about how people work, what they expect, how it is built, and therefore they reveal patterns, and they can even add a unique character by in there. So there is a sense of the aesthetics of bugs where flaws can actually tell a story, right? So I think I did probably many weeks ago an interesting Smart QA musings on some of the actual issues that I found in a backing application, but I was not commenting upon it. I was trying to look at it from the lens of a user and then trying to say, look, from the aspect of usage and usability and so on, and I was trying to talk about the journey, so to speak, and how somebody missed the idea of a journey, right? And all I was trying to do is, why did they miss the idea of journey? It's not that they didn't know, they probably didn't focus on that particular lens. So if they had understood that flaw, I'm sure they could have done a better story. And I do understand now that they've got a completely revamped system, which is significantly interesting to what I'd originally seen. So, which means there is, the bugs had some value, and somebody was smart enough to figure this out, and somebody enjoyed doing that, right? So it's like the kintsugi pottery here. If you expand and look at the idea of flow, a dancer's flow, and in whatever form of dance, whether it be the Western or the Eastern, so to speak, the idea of dance, the idea of painting, if you will, is not about the dancer. It is about how they fill the space, how they create certain gaps. And therefore, the idea here is there white space? Because white space, that is space that is not used. So even when you write something, you don't want to fill up an entire slide. You don't want to fill up an entire document, because the white space adds character. It allows us to read. That means it's emptiness, right? And therefore, how does what we don't test, or the white space between tests, how do they shape the idea of coverage? How do they give us a better insight? Just like the negative space in art makes the subject stand out. Because if you want to make a subject stand out, you must have an empty kind of a uncluttered background. Only then the subject stands out. And therefore, the question that we're asking really is, where is the silence in your design? Where does the negative space reveal? And therefore, the idea of leaving some room, leaving some white space can focus attention, bring in some clarity. And therefore, certain gaps illuminate than just the coverage. There is one thing that I do very frequently and I also have done it with a couple of customers before, and that is in the context of defects. Looking at the white space in defects and what was that I did and what did I learn from that exercise. Most often than not, and I in fact wrote an article on that many years ago, and that was about we analyze defects and then we do a lot of defect analytics, we publish reports, we publish charts and so on. Now, defects are the ultimate manifestation of potential problems, right, or problems itself. Now, there are also problems which are probably not yet found or not there. And that is the white space. So what I was trying to analyze is, okay, we found these kinds of problems, but why didn't we find these kinds of problems? I mean, if there were some other potential kind of issues that were probable, but they were not there in our defect list, why is it they didn't find? Did we not find it because the product is solid or because we could have missed? So I was more looking at it from not the analysis of the bugs, but I was looking at the analysis of the white space behind the bugs, which is, why didn't we find this? What could have gone wrong? And therefore, it helped me refine, especially the test suites which were in for a maintenance kind of a project, where they had products which was running version 9, they've been in the field for 10 years, and and yet there are some problems that do occur. They may not occur on a daily basis, but if one or two problems occur, then the outage is much higher, because the system has become solid, the problem has become more ubiquitous. And therefore, as the systems become more complex and they spend more time in the field, obviously the problems are more ubiquitous, and therefore the negative space becomes a more interesting thing to keep in mind, because there is a lot of power in what is left unsaid. And that's what I tried to use in one of the consulting spaces that I did. And it was interesting because we found that we could improve the defect yield by a significant number. I think we got about 5x or something. So what it meant was, analyzing the negative space gave me more ideas to find out some interesting problems, which in a typical regression suite was useless because they were just running the same thing. So that's one kind of analogy that I can connect on to this particular, so to speak, the content. Now, here is an example of a paint, right? It's a very colorful table with a lot of paint that is there. And we're really asking, how does this relate? How does the idea of the painter's palette relate to the test data? I'm sure you might have noticed that sometimes people use simple fake test values which are artificial, and some of them end up creating a far better, richer, more closer to real life data set. And therefore, when you kind of put that in context of the painter's palette, we're really asking and saying, hey, do we use a full range of values like a rich, colorful palette, or we settle for a set of monotones like stuck in black and white? And therefore, the analogy that I'm trying to bring about here using the painter's palette from an artistic sense is the richness and the variation of test data, which we all know uncovers the more subtle behavior rather than fake data. So when you generate meaningful synthetic data which reflect a lot more power, which is especially important in large case enterprise systems, certainly they have a much more better richness. And it's like saying, they have more deeper colors, better shades, and more depth, and therefore the chances of us possibly finding anomalies, finding problems is much higher. So all we're trying to correlate the idea is from the test data perspective. Maybe, the idea, the connection to a painter's palette could be interesting, so that we don't settle for the monotones when we can explore the full color spectrum. So if you watch the train of thought, we were trying to look at various facets. I'm not trying to say that I covered all the facets, so to speak, but then we looked at data, we looked at design, we looked at understanding, we looked at composition of test suites, and so on and so forth, connecting into certain forms of artistry and seeking certain ideas and inspirations, right? And if I go to the music part, and before we land into a couple of more and then we wind down, we're really talking about the notion of improvisation. Any musician, in this case is a jazz musician pictured up there, of course they prepare. They do come prepared to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do in this concert. These are the songs that I'm going to sing. This is how I'm going to sing. So there is a certain amount of meaningful preparation that goes up front. But then music is not, the concept is not about rendering exactly what was planned, and we know that. So a jazz musician's mindset is when you come and perform, and based on how the audience interacts and how the nuances are in terms of acoustics and a few other things, there is a sense of improvisation that normally occurs. And I'm quite sure every artist understands that, be it a dancer, be it a musician, whatever, be it an actor. There is a constant sense of improvisation. I'm sure you understand that much better when you watch a comedy show, right? A massive amount of improvisation. And therefore, there is a sense of a certain structured freedom that is out there. It's not madness, it's very structured, much akin to what we do probably in the exploratory style. So we're saying, look, the act of validation when we do, there is a certain structure and an order. We do come up with certain plans, strategy, test cases, scenarios, whatever it is, even suites, automated suites and so on. But then the intent is, when do you go off script? And what's your favorite riff, so to speak, from a music perspective? So we're just trying to connect and say, look, ultimately craftsman is about improvisation. So when you become a craft, you know how to improvise. And obviously some of the finest discoveries come from improvising and following the flow. Something that I absolutely enjoy in every of the Smart QA musings, because a lot of the Smart QA musings that are there are improvisations that occur on the moment. Some interesting idea flashes and I sometimes share, and sometimes improvisation can go bad too. It's not that everything is good, but then I can't go and do a completely scripted presentation here for sure, because especially in this, it's not possible. So the idea here is to look at the idea of, use the notion of music and look at it from how I adapt and assure to the whole idea of spontaneity. And that spontaneity, if it becomes a well-formed habit because of great preparation, it sets up in us in a sense of flow, and that's what I call as immersive kind of test. And that immersion, the act of being in that, it breeds the spontaneity, breeds the process of discovery, enhances my ability to look for all kinds of information, and therefore expands my field of view. And therefore, the question that we started off is, how do we blend the idea of structure with spontaneous insight? And that's not like trying to find a specific answer, but the idea is to say, look, that's important to have this interesting blend, so that, it doesn't seem like a monotone execution of pre-done something. And I'm sure we appreciate that heck of a lot. But then the idea was to connect it to the artistic form, especially in this case, the idea of music. When you look at it from the architecture sense, and you say, here is a blueprint, and here is what the system is going to be it a new system or an extended, one of the ideas that is especially important at the early stage, which is probably not as well followed consistently, is the notion of testability. Because you're trying to examine, is it testable? Can I observe things? Can I validate things? And therefore, we are getting a much more deeper sense of what's going to possibly occur by looking at it from the testability angle, just like an architect would kind of figure this out from the blueprint and imagine how the building is going to shape out, right? And of course, there are other issues that will pop up while we are building. But the idea here is that following the design principle that form follows the function. Because ultimately we want something useful, we want something beautiful. And therefore, the real question the real thing that we're trying to put in place is the spec, is the system at the end of the day, are they testable? And therefore, if the systems are testable, they certainly invite curiosity and they help us build a better sense of confidence. And testable means, the notion of spec and the notion of construction in the early stage of architecture, we're putting in certain hooks to make it, to observe, to control, to manipulate, to assess, which is what testability is. And that makes the entire act of testing much more pleasurable, because we end up having a good design. And that reflects on, quote unquote, the architecture system and the architecture of test. And therefore, think of testability as a good design mechanism where form follows a function. And therefore, the question that we're asking is, can you feel the testability of system just as we sense a well-designed object, right? So, and finally, if we kind of try to come to a closure in a minute or so, we're really asking, is there a narrative in what we do? Is there, the reports that we put out, the bugs that we talk about, the status reports that we put out, or whatever reports, are they dry or are they compelling stories? And therefore elevate the idea that testing is actually a storytelling, and just like you say, user story, so to speak, where we say, let's make it less dry, let's look at it from perspective user and what they do and what they expect. In a much better sense, we are looking at the idea, can testing be a storytelling, where there is a setup, there is a journey, there is a twist as in a bug, and there is a resolution. And therefore, how do you narrate your discoveries? What makes a report, maybe a bug report, maybe an activity report, a little more memorable? I am not saying that, all of us have got to write some fantastic poetry in each of these reports, but the idea here is, once you make it go from the sense of dry to sense of something more living, then the recipient also sees little more, understands deeper, and probably engages better, because after all, it's more like a story where each test, each finding, it adds a certain element of suspense, learning, and meaning for everybody, team. The recipient could be anybody else. So the idea here is, look, it's not about just generating reports and putting in facts and putting in pictures and putting in, numbers and statistics, but it's something more than a bit of a narrative, suspense, and resolution, which engages us and allows us to go beyond the entire notion of what it is. Right? And therefore, you're really asking a question, what makes a bug report, let's say, memorable? So to kind of wind down, what I think we were talking about is trying to look at what I was trying to muse about really is about connecting some of these, the mundane things that we do, the technical things that we do, and seeing it from the lens of art, the personal sense of craftsmanship, and therefore approaching the QA as an art, where we shift from simply finding defects to creating absolutely meaningful experiences, where every test is like a brushstroke, every data set is like a palette, every student like a composition, right? And therefore there is a heightened sense of what we do. Of course, initially we spend initial years, we understand the science, and then as we graduate and become more experienced, we convert the science into meaningful engineering and deliver value to the team, the company, the customer. And then as we mature, we start seeing the sense of art in addition to the science of engineering, and that's what I'm trying to allude to here. And therefore, I don't want us to think that I'm trying to stray away and kind of replace the rigor by giving it fluffy things like aesthetics and art. Ultimately, to me, that it doesn't replace rigor; it elevates it. It blends the precision with a lot more imagination, and therefore, let your testing reflect not just the idea of correctness, but care, not just completeness, but the craft. And that to me is what has probably, stay still very passionate about this discipline, maybe having started kind of exploring this idea after about 15 years of development. And the last 25 years, over the 40-year career, close to maybe 35 years career, has been very interesting. And each day is, in some sense, elevational. Of course, there are a lot of mundane things that all of us do. But then, it is the sense of something more, that something beyond, some better parallels that I think makes every day a little more interesting and, and hopefully elevates my mundane day into a far better stuff that we do. Okay? So, thank you.